Hi, everyone, and welcome to Lit Chick on a Mighty Blaze. I'm your host, Julie Gerstenblatt, and I am here today with none other than Rhys Bowen. Welcome, Rhys.
Hi, good to see you, Julie.
It's good to see you too. I'm going to just do a little intro where I talk about Rhys and all of her accolades, although many of you, I'm sure, know her and her work. Rhys Bowen is the New York Times bestselling author of more than 40 novels, including The Venice Sketchbook, nominated for the Edgar Award for Best Novel, The Victory Garden, The Tuscan Child, which has sold over 1 million copies worldwide, and the World War II based In Farley Field, winner of the Left Coast Crime Award for Best Historical Mystery Novel, and the Agatha Award for Best Historical Novel. Rhys was born in Bath, England, and educated at London University, but now divides her time between California and Arizona. I know that today she's in California. Her full bio is long and impressive, and we will include a link to it in our chat because it's worth a read. But let's get to our conversation. Today, we will be discussing her latest standalone novel, Where the Sky Begins. Let me make sure everybody can see it. So, again, welcome, Rhys.
Oh, thank you, Julie. Yeah, and I love the cover, don't you? I think it's
love the cover.
very evocative cover. Yeah,
It's so evocative, and I mean, it really does bring us right to the beginning of that novel where Josie is standing in rubble and deciding what's next, right? What's going to happen in her life. And we get to go on this incredible journey with her as she figures that out, and as many people during war, and in particular World War II, needed to do. I absolutely love this book. So, can you just start by telling us a little bit about the story for those who haven't read it yet?
yeah, I'd love to. Well, this heroine is a very different one. She was a challenge for me because in the past, my heroines have been educated women, upper class women sometimes, who've had some sort of skills for coping because they've had, they've traveled, they've been educated, etc. Josie is a very simple woman from the East End of London, sort of born into poverty, raised in poverty, stuck in a very bad marriage. And then World War II comes. And for her, it's a bit of an escape because her husband's called up into the army. And so for the first time, she can get a job. He wouldn't let her work before. And she finds a lovely job at a tea shop where she's happy as happy can be. And then that shop is bombed and the lady who runs it is killed. And so it's like back to square one again for Josie. And she thinks, what shall I do next? Until she too, her house is bombed and she is buried in rubble. She thinks she's going to die. She's buried in the rubble. She's miraculously found. And then she's brought out with nothing. And that's what I wanted to do in this book, to say, what would it be like if you were completely reborn? She starts this book with absolutely nothing, no clothes, nothing at all. And so she's wounded. And of course, so many people at that time are being bombed. And I thought, what would happen to all these people? There was no room for them in hospital because they had to make room for the more seriously wounded. So where would she go? So she's evacuated out to the country with some lovely children. And she's never really been to the countryside before, at least not like this. She sees, these little narrow streets in London, and then it's often smoggy. So you rarely enjoy the sky. And suddenly she's got this huge sky of the east of England where it's completely flat. And you can see for miles and miles, you'll see a church steeple like 10 miles over there. So you can imagine for her, it was just overwhelming. Like, my God, look at this. Look at all this countryside. So it was a huge, and so she thinks she's safe being sent out into the middle of the countryside. And then she hears this roar and these planes take off. And she finds she's right next to one of the big bomber bases where the planes take off every night for Germany. And they come back in the morning and half of them don't return. So she suddenly realizes this is war, and wherever you go, you're not safe. So, that's how it starts off for her.
Sorry, yes, finish what you're saying.
I was going to say, from then we see her resilience. I think it comes out almost immediately. She's billeted with a very aristocratic woman who says to her, well, when you've recovered from your injuries, we will decide what your duties will be. And Josie looks at her and says, I don't mind helping out, but I ain't no servant. And you see right then she's not going to be walked on in spite of everything she's gone through. And I think through the whole book, you just see she has this wonderful glass half full mentality and resilience that get her through really difficult times.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to talk about that, the triangle of people in that house, Miss Harcourt, Kathleen, and Josie. There's such an interesting dynamic. But
Yeah,
first, I wanted to mention your title because you just spoke about the sky and where the sky begins.
yeah.
Did you, and I saw that right away when she's bombed and she's lying there and there's no roof over her head and she sees the night sky, and
Mhm.
I love that. I was like, oh, good one, and let's see where else the sky is going to
Yeah.
open up for her, both literally and metaphorically. Did you know that was going to be your title, or when did you know?
I didn't. You know what I call as a working title? I called it The Tea Shop at the Edge of Eternity, that I still love. I I still love that title, but it was shot down by the marketing guys because there are too many words on it, and if this is being sold on Amazon, you can't read them on a thumbnail. Um,
Mhm.
so that was one thing. The other one they said was the word tea shop would put off any male readers. Don't know why. I mean, I'm sure
Interesting.
men enjoy tea shops too. But anyway, so I had to listen to them. And then I thought, well, we toyed with other things, lots of the woman from London, the woman from the rubble, the wife of the soldier's wife, all those sort of
Mhm, mhm.
things. So many of them these days. And then I thought the one thing that's important in this book is the sky. As you said, it starts off with, with her being bombed and with seeing that little star up there and giving her hope, and then this enormous sky. And my favorite scene in the book, I think, is when her husband's come home severely wounded and she's been sent back to look after him. And she realizes this is going to be my life forever now.
Mhm.
And a new wave of bombers come over and she stands in the street and she screams up at them, here I am, take me. I mean,
Yeah.
that was for me a very powerful scene to write.
It was a powerful scene to read, and also just the idea of being next to, once she's in Lincolnshire, the Royal Air Force, as you said, the idea of planes flying in the sky and the danger those bring, but also those hope, for the RAF,
Yeah,
pilots,
yeah, yeah,
and the relationship she then has with one in particular.
yeah.
So the title really works, and I'm glad that they pushed that on that and you came up with this one.
I'm
And
happy with
although tea shops were certainly important as well,
it.
so let's talk about those three main. I see them as the core of this book, and the dynamic between Miss Harcourt, Kathleen. Miss Harcourt is the curmudgeony, old, wealthy, very staid and very private loner who lives in the home where Josie's placed, very much against Miss Harcourt's wishes. And Kathleen is an Irish servant who's been with her for 20 years, I think, or for quite a long time. And she too is a loner, and she's a very difficult person. So talk about that dynamic and what it was like as a writer, and what you played with there.
Yeah, I think, Miss Harcourt is fairly easy to understand, especially as we learn her backstory later.
Mm.
She is, she's been brought up in isolation. She comes from a time when there really was an upper class who were waited on all the time. Her father was a very autocratic man, and so she's grown up expecting to be surrounded by servants and certainly distancing herself from all the people in the village. I'm not one of them. But of course, now the servants have all gone. Her money is gone too. She's sort of pretty hard up suddenly. And she's just got this one servant left. And she's an Irish woman called Kathleen, who's been there since she came as a young girl to be a servant for the old master. And she's a very complex character, I think, because she's not educated. She's out of her environment. She's not in Ireland. She's in someone else's house in England. There used to be lots of servants, and she knew her place among them. But now it's all up to her. She's supposed to cook, and she's not a very good cook. She's supposed to clean, and she's not a very good cleaner. And they've got along well enough until Josie comes. And then suddenly Josie is, Kathleen is not sure what to make of her. Josie says, well, as soon as I heal a bit, I can help you. And that seems like a good thing. I'll do the cooking. I'm quite a good cook. And Kathleen thinks, well, yeah, that might be okay. But then Miss Harcourt starts to take an interest in Josie. And that's where the jealousy kicks in. Not
Mhm.
only the jealousy, but the fear. If she gets rid of me, where would I go? There's no family left in Ireland. She has nowhere and nothing in the world. So I think the desperation is always there. And that's why she can never say to Josie, oh, I'm glad you're here. Let's do this together. She
Right.
can never give in. And she can never, I suppose, because she's been so isolated for so long, she can never really share with Josie. Let's sit down after dinner, have a nice cup of tea and a good natter.
Yeah, and that's what you want for
Yeah,
them, and you see moments when it's close, and Josie is so great
yeah,
at being, optimistic, as you said, and sort of warming to people and being
yeah,
open and
yeah,
trying to make this change. So that's fun to see as a reader as well. And I'm wondering about, like you mentioned, class.
yeah,
You really play with a lot here in terms of class, as well as displaced people, and you have German Jews in this as well. So you have class and
yeah,
people who are not accepted
yeah,
because of their station, and you also have people who are not accepted because of their origin of birth,
yeah.
and being seen as outsiders, foreigners, and possibly even threats. You even have JJ, the pilot from Poland. So talk about this crowd of characters in this small town and all that you do with that.
Yeah. Well, obviously, class, if you've read the rest of my novels, plays a big part because I think it's still important in England.
Mhm.
It's one of those things that I'm married to an aristocrat, I know.
Mhm.
I've spent time with his family where the older people said, "Do you remember that joke we played on the butler?" That sort of thing happens. Um, and the interesting thing is that the upper class still think in the back of their minds that God created them and then he rested. And you still see it even these days. It's just I was at a sherry party in the Cotswolds, which is a very snooty area, and the hostess said, "My dears, you'll never guess who's bought that house across the valley." And they all said, "Oh, do tell." And then she said, "My dears, he's a grocer." It
No, a grocer.
it wouldn't have mattered if he'd owned Safeway. To them,
Right.
he was still a grocer, and so it's still there. So the fact is that Josie, you will notice I play with the class with the normal upper class
Mhm.
pilots.
Yeah,
The moment they meet Josie, they treat her as less than them. And
right.
I think that's what attracts her to Mike to start with. He treats her with great respect as an equal from day one. And I think that's wonderful for her that she's treated as a person, as an equal. She loves that. So you've got that dynamic. You've also got the dynamic of German Jews. And this is something that is really touches you very deeply because these people escape Germany to escape the horrors, and then they're speaking with a German accent. So everywhere they go in England, there is suspicion that they're a spy. So, instead of being safe, you can never you have to tread very carefully everywhere you go. And this very nice doctor who we meet, he has had to leave his big hospital in Birmingham, in a big city, where he was an eye surgeon. He's had to leave that because there was just too much suspicion and hatred. So you've got that, and then you've got the Polish pilot. And again, he'd go through the same thing. He came to England, he escaped from Poland with his plane, and he came to join the RAF. And yet, if he sat in a cafe in town and anybody heard him talking, they'd say he's a spy. So it shows that in the wartime, everybody's nerves were very much on edge, and nobody wanted to trust anybody very much. So you had this dynamic going through the whole thing.
I think you really show, there are so many, let's say, there are a lot of World War II novels, and yet you are drawn to this, and you do show something that I hadn't read before in the literature from the period about this small town, about so many kinds of displaced people, and like you say, people of different classes and all of that together.
Mhm.
So, what do you think it is about World War II, or you also write about World War One, but what is it you think that draws you to that time and is so interesting, kind of perennially interesting to readers?
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, that World War II has suddenly become so incredibly popular. I think one of the things is that the last people who were involved in that war are just dying.
Mm,
And you suddenly realize if we don't keep this as a history, everybody will forget it. You know, we've already got Holocaust deniers. I mean, it's just beyond belief that that can happen already. So we have to preserve as much as possible of this so that people in the future will know what it's like. All the simple things like that come out in this book, like rationing and going without, and you you might have a ration book and go into the shop and say, "I'd like some sugar, please," and they'd say, "We don't have any." It was, you had to make do with so little in the war, and yet everybody was cheerful. I think one of the reasons I like to write about it is it was the last time when we had a clear sense of good versus evil. Every war since then has been, is that not quite sure about that. But then everybody knew that if we didn't do our part, evil would swallow the world. And so people willingly joined up
mhm,
um, and to the forces, and people willingly went to work in factories and went to dig fields on the land. Everybody did what they had to. And I think you had that feeling of we're all in this together. Um, Another reason is there are so many good stories that are just coming out now. After the war, there were lots of books, and they were all books about male heroism. Look
mm,
at me, I flew this plane. Look at me, I was on this PT boat. Aren't we wonderful? And nobody said, well, behind the scenes, there were an awful lot of women who did really great and wonderful things. And now those are coming out. The women who were spies, who were dropped into France, and their chances of survival were 25%. And women who went to work in the factories, women who dug in the fields. But then I wanted to show the ordinary women at home. And in this book, you'll find in the people in the village, almost everybody in that village has got someone who
mm.
who is either in the forces or they've already lost a relative. My son was in that boat, was torpedoed. My son is missing. It affected everybody, and so everybody pulled together. So you had this wonderful feeling of that we're all in this together. And I just want to show this is what it was like for ordinary people. It was hard.
Yeah, I think, seeing the victory gardens, the idea that the people, the guy with the cows is giving cream to help Josie with her tea shop that
Yeah,
she sets up in Miss Harcourt's kitchen eventually, or in her parlor.
yeah,
And the way people, "I can find this for you. I'll give you some of the ration because I don't use this flour," etcetera,
yeah.
is really incredible. And I have a question about, how do you come up with this? And you write more than a book a year. You're writing 2 to 3 books a year. Are you a plotter? Do you know ahead of time how much of this story is
Um,
is outlined or planned before you hit the
um, no,
page?
I'm not a plotter. I'm sorry. Well, every
Oh.
time every time I talk at a writing workshop and I say, well, when I start, I don't know very much, and I see these looks of blank despair on faces. Um, I know always the setting I'm going to set it in, and I know sort of pretty much the overall thing. I knew that Josie was going to be bombed and sent to the country, and
Mm,
I knew there was going to be a dynamic that she would meet a pilot. I didn't quite know how it would play out with Stan. We just had to let. I'm a great believer in the fact if you create characters, then it's their story, and you have to see
mm,
where they want to go. So if Stan, I knew Stan would have to show up again at some time, and there would have to be some sort of sorting out of things, but I wasn't quite sure when that would happen. And I thought I wanted to have some sort of spying element in this. I write mysteries. I find it
mhm.
very hard to write a book in which there's no sort of mystery element, or halfway through the book, I think, well, there haven't been any bodies yet. Um, so I think that mystery element always has to creep into my books because that's just part of who I am. But
Mhm,
uh, and I didn't really know what was going to happen at the end. I knew that Mike would have a secret.
mhm.
I wasn't quite sure whether he would die, whether he would crash and she would lose him, or what. So just luckily, she decided to go to Bletchley Park, so that sorted a lot of things out.
Right.
Yeah,
That was a great twist for her as well, and the mystery element, which I don't want to give too much away, was terrific as well in terms of keeping us guessing too. And it's so interesting to know that you didn't quite know, as obviously you then figured it out and planned it for us. But
Yeah.
I really enjoyed watching her. Stan is an abusive husband.
Mhm.
This man who she meets, Mike Johnson, has a dark past that we don't quite understand, but he seems wonderful on the surface to her and is wonderful to her in the present. She can't just leave her marriage, and we don't know what to wish for her. It's hard to say. She feels, as you said at the beginning, like relief that he is called up to war, and then we see her do so well without him that it does seem that that's what we want for her. But it's great how you kept pulling, you pulled on those strings really well to keep us guessing. And I think that mystery writer in you knows certainly how to plot all those kinds of um, things. So, do you prefer a mystery? Do you like writing a series versus a standalone? And what are the challenges and benefits of each? Because this is a standalone novel.
Yeah.
Um, and then you have three, I think, other series
Yeah.
as well. So talk
Yeah.
about that.
Well, they both have their attractions. I think the writing a series is lovely because it's like going back to a family reunion each time. You know your characters, you know their setting, and so you start off being welcomed back, and then something new will happen to those characters, and that's always fun. I'm up to book 16 in the Royal Spiness series now, and I think, oh, wouldn't it be fun if she went to Paris? Wouldn't it be fun if something happened at a fashion show with Chanel? So I
That
can,
would be fun.
yeah. So I do things like that, and the series is nice. But then the thing with the series is you're very limited. There's only a certain amount you can do with those characters because they are in their time and place and environment. So I love the standalones because I can get a completely different idea. And my editor is so great because I say to her, I'd really love to do a book set in Venice, and it's set in Venice during World War II, and she goes, "Oh, wonderful." And then I'd say, and I'd really love to do a book that is about someone who has a garden in World War One and dabbles in herbs and cures people. She goes, "Oh, wonderful." So anything, pretty much anything I say, she loves. And then I can visit these people for a little time. And then I can say bye bye and go again. And I can tell you, every single book I get emails saying, I do hope there's going to be a sequel to this. I want to know what happens. It will be, I want to know what happens if Josie and Mike go to New Zealand and have an airline. What's going to happen then? And of course, the nice thing about a standalone is that you can walk away. You can leave them in a happy place and say, okay, you're good now. I've gone. Goodbye.
Right, and so you don't feel the pressure
No.
from the readers for those. You say, "No, you can read
Yeah.
my series if you want more
Yeah.
of."
The only one I actually left completely open was the end of In Farley Field, which was the first of the big standalones.
Mm.
And I did leave open at the end of that maybe one of the characters was going to go up to Scotland to train in the Secret Service to be a spy. So I left that open at the end, and the characters could do. We know that two of the characters were involved, one at Bletchley Park, one at MI5. So, we know that there could be another story with them. But my editor said, no, we need to move on to other things. So um,
Um,
so that's nice too. I've got lots. One thing I'm blessed with is so many ideas. I will never get to them all, and then I have something planned out. Like, okay, not next year, but the year afterwards, I want to write about this. And then suddenly, boom, this new idea comes, and I think, oh, well, that would be interesting to write about too. Now, does that come before this one? So, that's fun. That's always fun. It's good
it
to have something to look forward to all the time.
and it seems like the imagination is endless, and it sounds like you get tons of encouragement from your editor. Do you have readers, early readers, or anybody that you sort of workshop with, or are you completely working on your own for these?
I do have early readers. What I do is I write when I'm writing a first draft. I write every day. Um, I make myself write about 1,500 words, about 5 pages a day, and I'm not allowed to leave and go and do anything else until I've done that. So Some days that comes really easily and I zoom on and I probably do 7 pages. Other days, as you know, it's like pulling teeth. I get up,
Mhm.
I walk around, I get a cup of coffee, I sit down again, and then I say, "This is rubbish. Nobody's going to want to read this, blah, blah, blah." And then the first thing I do the next day is to edit what I've done the day before. So I look at it and I go, "Oh, this wasn't quite as bad as I thought it was." And then, so I go all the way through to the end of the book with the first draft.
Okay.
Um, then I sort of go through and I do like a first rewrite, a first sort of big, do we need to know this here? Let's move this around a bit. And then I give it to 3 different people. I give it to one of my daughters, who's now my co writer for the Molly
Mm,
Murphy series. And she is really good at pacing. And she will say things like, "Oh, this scene, especially in mysteries, how about if we didn't find this out until here?"
mm,
And I go, "Oh, that's a good idea." So she does that. And then it goes to another of my daughters who's just a really involved reader. She reads and reads and reads and for pleasure. And she will say things like, "Oh, don't make her say that. That sounds really petty." So I take note of these things. And then I give it to my husband, who is Mr. Picky. And he goes through and he says, "You've used that word 3 times in this paragraph." Um, and then he will also say, "No man would ever say that."
mm.
And I say, "Well, he's not like you. He's a sensitive man." And so there's quite a few raised voices during that period. But so then I go through with those comments in mind and I do a complete rewrite and polish. And then it goes to my agents and they read it and they give me their input. And then finally it goes to my editor. So by the time it gets to my editor, I always hear, "Oh, your books are so clean. We never have to do anything. It's wonderful." But yes, it's been through the layers before it gets there.
That's wonderful. And so then what can we ask what's coming next and what are you working on for next?
Well, the thing I'm excited about that's coming absolutely next, if you're a fan of the Royal Spiness series, if you don't know that, she's a minor royal in the 1930s. She's related to the King of England. She happens to be penniless, but she's been surviving now for this is the 16th book, so she's survived on her own just about by her fingertips. And in this book, I send her to Paris. She has a friend, Belinda, is in Paris, who Belinda's always had a great flair for fashion design. And she's sort of apprenticed herself to Chanel to really fine tune her skills. And so Georgie goes to stay with Belinda. Well, Georgie's now married, and her husband, we don't quite know what he does, but he's some sort of spy. And so he has work to do in Paris. And so Georgie stays with Belinda while Darcy does his work.
Mhm.
And a big fashion, it's the fall collection that's coming out with Chanel. And so there's absolute chaos in the Chanel. And at the same time, Darcy asks Georgie to do a little bit of spy, well, a sort of rather what sounds like a really dangerous thing. And she can't really refuse. And he makes it sound as if it would be her part in this will be so simple. Well, of course, it's not going to be simple. And I love this series too because all the recurring characters come in. We always meet Mrs. Simpson, who's now it's 1936, and her beloved has just become king, and she thinks she's going to marry the king. Of course, we'll see what happens there.
Right?
And Georgie's mummy, who is a famous actress, now living with a very rich industrialist in Germany. And so we've got that thread hanging over us for the future that mummy is now in Berlin. And when she comes shopping in Paris, it turns out that she has a minder. And so we get a hint of what life might be going to be like in Berlin soon. So
Mm,
Georgie's a slight frisson of alarm goes through Georgie about this. So I'm foreshadowing a tiny bit in these books. But
wow.
anyway, the Georgie books are always funny. They're light and funny.
Yeah,
But I find as the series goes on, we've got more and more this undercurrent of this is happening in Europe. This is not good. This is getting worse.
right. You
So
can't help it because as you march on through time, that is where you're going to end up.
yeah. So this does have this undercurrent of danger in it too. Um,
Right.
but that comes out in November,
Okay.
and I finished the next Molly Murphy book with my daughter, and that
Great.
that comes out next March. And uh, and then I've just finished the first draft. I haven't got the rewrites back from my editor yet on next year's big standalone, which takes place in Paris before World War II,
Mm.
in England at the beginning of the war, in France in the war, and then in Australia after the war. So it's quite a, as they
Wow.
say, a sweeping novel. Yes,
Oh, that sounds
yeah,
terrific.
and
Um,
it's called Island of Lost Boys.
okay. And what is it like working with your daughter?
Um, that was interesting. You know, I'd put the Molly Murphy series on one side. I'd done 17 books, and I simply didn't have time to do 3 books a year. But I was getting all these emails saying, "When's another Molly book coming out? I miss her so much." So my daughter came to me and she said, "I think I'd like to do the Molly Murphy series with you." And I was a little ambivalent, I have to tell you, because she's my daughter and I love her. And I thought, well, what if this doesn't work? I knew she was a good writer, but
Mhm.
working with someone's a bit different. So I said, okay, well, we'll give it a shot. And she came up. I thought I was going to have to hold her hand a lot and say, no, we need to make this clear first. But anyway, she came up with the plot for the first book we did together. And she read all 17 books and she got Molly's voice. It's first person, got Molly's
Yeah.
voice perfectly to start with. And so it's been so easy. We talk through ahead of, we're not apt, we know more or less what the story will be, the big arc of the story, and we know where it's going to be set. And she loves the research. And so we start writing and she'll say, well, I can really picture that party scene, so I'm going to do that. And she leaves me with all the scenes where Molly has to get across New York, because in the early books in that series, I would actually go and walk anywhere that Molly walked to make sure what I could see, what I could hear, everything.
Mhm.
So I do know my New York of Molly's time very well. So if Molly has to go from A to B, I always have to do those scenes. And, and sometimes I do the scenes where clues have to come out because I'm probably a bit more skilled at that. But
Mhm.
overall, we it's so easy. She says, I'll take it ahead and you go on from there. And so it's been a delight. We're doing one at the moment. We're just starting off doing one that's set in the Catskills at,
Mm.
at the very beginning of the bungalow colonies. And so we knew we wanted to set it with one of the characters' families in a lodge in the Catskills. But she's, in her research, has found out all these interesting things, like there was a brand new state park next door
Mm.
and there was a bluestone mine next door. So those two, environmental clash, good idea for murder right there. So she's found out all these good things, and we know now where all the train lines went, and it's been fascinating. So
How
it's a great excuse to sit and to talk to each other every day. My husband comes in and I'm lying on my bed and he goes, "You're talking to Claire again, aren't you?" Yes, we're working. We're talking through the scene. Okay.
Where is she? Where is she located?
In Arizona. So in the winter, we can actually sit next to each other and work. But in the summer, although we were down in, I rented a house in San Diego in July. And so we were there. We walked along the beach saying, okay, now, so she has to do so and so. But what if that man, no, we talked that out as we walked. So that was
That's
good.
great. My husband and I once took a long drive and decided to come up with the plot for a movie. And I remember driving along, and it had a bit of like twists and turns, and we were on this twisty road, and we looked over at the river, and we were like, "Oh, and then we're gonna do this and that," and it's
And
fun
then
to
the car has to go
collaborate.
off the edge. Yes.
Yeah, it was really fun to collaborate.
Yeah.
So do we have questions, Margaret, from our audience? Margaret Pinard, thank you. She's our fanner and producer today. Okay. Having just read my first D.E. Stevenson, I see parallels in the class consciousness and loner explorations of her and your books. Did you find inspiration in World War II era books?
I do like to read other World War II era books. Um, Mostly the ones I've read have been more, the fiction has been more of the spy variety. The Rose Code was excellent, so I've read quite a few like that. Um, what I read before I actually started writing World War II were a lot of first-person diaries of, there've been several books published in which women have. There was one in which just an ordinary housewife and what she did every day and I went to the shops and I had my meat ration, but all they had left was heart. I don't know how to cook heart,
Mhm.
and so things like that can really bring it to life because these little things. And I also read, before I wrote In Farley Field, which part of it takes place in Bletchley Park, I read all of the first person accounts of people who worked at Bletchley Park. And I have to say, when I read the Rose Code, I was going through it going, oh, you've done your homework perfectly, because that's true. I went to Bletchley Park. I spent a long time walking around, and she's done her homework, which is nice. So yeah, I enjoy reading about that era too, because as I say, it's a time of heightened emotions. If you're going to have a story and it's set against a backdrop of never knowing when you're going to be bombed, um, then you've got this heightened emotion going through the whole book. So they make great stories.
Yeah. I read The Rose Code as well, and I did learn about Bletchley Park from it, and it's so interesting to me that there seems to be this um, renewed interest in spies in particular and in that place. And
Yeah.
I really want to visit it now, and I love
Oh,
what
yeah.
you.
Yeah, they recreated exactly as it was in World War II, and you can walk through those huts, and they have them set up. Like, for example, one of them could have someone's thing half in the typewriter and a cup of coffee next to it, and the phone's ringing as if she's just gone down the hall. So you're really right there.
Without the cigarette smoke, though, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
that's yeah, and you can see how cold or how hot it was based on which time of year you go and visit. So yeah, no, it's a lovely thing to visit, and yeah,
Right,
I loved it. Yeah.
right. Margaret, do we have any other questions? Yes. In studying World War II propaganda, etc., what is the best way to cultivate "we are in this together" feeling?
Um, I think the major my husband will say this, he was a child in World War II and was very conscious of everything. Um, I think the major thing would be Churchill was an incredible rallier. He gave these he was one of those people in peacetime. He was an absolute pain in the you know what.
Mhm.
He was this overbearing, I'm always right sort of person. You really wouldn't want to invite to your dinner party because he was so rude. Um, but in wartime, he was this hero. His speeches just inspired the whole nation to think, we can do this. And of course, I think one of the things was we'd been through World War One. We saw what devastation it did to Europe and how it wiped out a whole generation of young men. And I think everybody in England thought we can't let that happen again. We have to stop these people. And of course, everybody was very aware now World War II, because everybody's got a radio, and
Right.
so everybody knows everything. You can give them the news as it happens. Um, and the BBC, I used to work for the BBC, and the BBC was always prided itself on giving the news as it really was. There was no coloring or anything. And in fact, people in Germany used to try and tune into the BBC to see what really was happening. So, that was maybe lack of propaganda. That was
Mm.
transparency in England. But everybody knew what was happening and they knew how terrible Hitler was. And so I think there was this collective feeling we have to stop this regime right now. Um, so yeah, it was. I'm sure a lot of propaganda went on. Every time you went into a shop, it would be "Don't waste," and every time you took a subway, there would be the lips sink ships sort of posters
Mhm.
up everywhere. "Don't help Mr. Hitler." "Don't talk loudly what you know when you're sitting in a cafe." All those things, those posters were out all the time, so people were very aware.
Hmm. Interesting. Margaret, we have time for maybe one more question. What has been your favorite place to visit for research?
Um, Well, this particular book, well, if you mean ever, then I wrote
I
a book.
think ever.
I
Yeah.
wrote a book set in Tuscany, and I wrote a book set in Venice. That's probably enough said. But uh, in fact, the Venice book, Venice is somewhere I know very well. I used to go there a lot as a child, but um, I was writing this book during the early days of the lockdown of the pandemic. And so for me to spend every day in Venice was such a blessing because I had all my photos, all my notes and everything. And like, oh yeah, now so I'm going to cross the Academia Bridge and I'm going to turn left here. Oh yeah, there's that dear little square. So that was all lovely. For this book, it was interesting. I'd done quite a lot of, well, obviously I'd done the Bletchley Park research ahead of time. But also I'd done other research ahead of time because my best friend from college lives absolutely there where I wrote the book, in that part of Lincolnshire. And I usually stay with her every time I go to England. So that countryside is very familiar to me. And they had taken me in the past when I was writing In Farley Field and The Tuscan Child, which are both about, one was about a fighter pilot, bomber pilot. I'd been to the World War II aircraft museums on the old air bases, and I'd been in the hangars, and I'd actually climbed inside a Lancaster bomber, so I know incredibly high up it was, and then the little narrow cockpit. And I'd seen the leather flight helmets they wore, and those flight suits, and how horribly cumbersome they were. You could hardly move in them. And I'd seen letters home that were recovered after a plane crashed and it never got to the sweetheart. I'd seen all of those things. They'd all made it so real for me, like this is exactly how it was. So I can bring it to life because I know it's real.
Right. Yes, I loved also the letters back and forth in this book and getting to see a little bit of the pieces of that and missing someone or wondering where they were or not knowing and
Yeah,
not hearing from them as well.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so I think that is all we have time for today. And I just want to say, everybody go out and read Where the Sky Begins. Thank you for joining us on Lit Chick today. Thank you, Rhys Bowen, for joining us and coming on to talk
Oh,
to us about this and all of your wonderful books.
oh, thank you, Julie. I look forward to talking with you about your upcoming book too.
Thank
That'll
you
be fun.
so
Yeah,
much.
yeah,
Yeah, that'll be fun.
yeah.
Okay, everybody, have a great weekend, and
Hi, everybody.
we'll see you next time on Lit Chick.